Thank you very much. Welcome to Tar Arts. I'm Steve Richards, columnist and BBC broadcaster. I've been asked to collate, I think the term is, the next 4 evenings, which Tar Arts are calling Journalists on Stage. And we've got tonight 2 of the very, very best. And the way this has come about, because there are 4 evenings, this is the first of the evenings, is very interesting, I think. And I thought I'd talk about it for 2 or 3 minutes before bringing Polly and David on stage, and then I'll tell you how we're going to work the evening. I kind of, and indeed Polly and David have experienced this as well. When you're writing as columnists or doing stuff on the BBC like the Today programme as pundits, we're quite often asked to go on as pundits. It's quite a weird experience, actually. And the more I've been thinking about it, the weirder it has become. And I've had to think about it because quite a lot of my peer group have said to me, I do a show which I take up to the Edinburgh Festival and I'm doing here on Saturday. Why do you do this live stuff in front of an audience? It's mad. And I've actually come to conclude that the madness is more the other stuff. So, for example, Polly and I write columns. And if you want a dialogue with the readership, it's constrained on the whole to the comments at the end of the columns. And I don't know if any of you have read the comments at the end of the columns, but the most sort of elevated it becomes is, "You lying bastard, you should be shot." And that isn't really a brilliant dialogue to have with an audience. And similarly, if you do some broadcasting, and this is an experience I think that I've had, Polly and David have had as well, where you get a call when some big political story is erupting around you. And it's from the Today programme, and you get really excited. Wow. And a producer from the Today programme says, is that Steve Richards? And I said, yeah, it is actually. It's Rupert here from the Today programme. By the way, every producer on the Today programme is called Rupert. It's compulsory, including the women, actually. And Rupert says to me, well, see, we're thinking of doing a discussion at the end of the Today programme tomorrow. So I know Polly and David have experienced this. We're having a discussion at the end of the Today programme about whether the coalition. It seems to be in a state of crisis at the moment. What are your thoughts? And so I'll start talking about Cameron, Osborne. Absolutely fascinating. And Clegg, is he going to stick with this coalition? You sort of talk for. By the end, and then Miliband. Is Miliband's price freeze going to work, or will it implode and rebound on him? Anyway, by the end of this conversation, you've spoken to Rupert for about 3 hours on the phone. So that's great. If you come in tomorrow morning, you're the last item on the Today programme. See you here at Broadcasting House about 8:30. The next night, you cannot sleep for excitement. All the thoughts are whirling round with a Clegg, with a Miliband, with a Cameron, coalition, all the things you want to say. And you go into Broadcasting House and you're led up to the Today programme studio. And it's then that things start to go downhill. You're led in and the producer says, it's all a bit rushed, we've had to add another item and all the rest of it. Still you're thinking, I must get my thought on, Cameron moving to the right, Osborne, blah, 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 Clegg all over the place. And I'm usually on with Anne McElvoy, who, I don't know whether you've heard of her, but she has to be on every Radio 4 outlet about once every 2 hours. It's been legally, it's a statute. And so we sit there, Anne looking cross, and me looking overexcited. And then it goes downhill because John Humphreys utters the following words to cue us in. So it seems as if the coalition is entering a new crisis. Clegg is disagreeing with Cameron. We're joined by Steve Richards and Anne McElvoy. The time is 2.5 minutes to 9. John, 2.5 minutes to 9? It's got to end at 9 o'clock. He says, John Humphrey says, Anne, your view on the crisis. And Anne says, well, clearly Cameron has to be more radical. He's got to move to the right. He's got to bring in the private sector into public services. He's got to show he's serious about public spending cuts and that austerity is here to stay. And he's got to win that argument into the second term. I'm looking at this bloody clock. It's 30 seconds left. And then John Humphrey says, Steve, what about you? Well, I think Anne is taking a bit of a simple... I'm sorry, we've run out of time. Thank you, folks. Tune in, Melvin Bragg's here in 2 minutes. And that's it. And that goes for the debate, and it becomes, I think, it's kind of slightly mad for us as pundits. But I suspect, not from an egotistical perspective, but it must be quite frustrating at times for the audience to listen to such superficial analysis, which is over in about 1.5 minutes. So I think these evenings, which I and Polly and David have done in all kinds of different ways for quite some time, are brilliant, because it means we can explore things in some detail. And it means that you can ask questions as well. So just to set us up now for our guest tonight, and then I'll tell you about the other days that Tara have arranged here for this unique Journalists on Stage, which, as I said, I think is more potent, more productive than other kinds of journalism. I'll tell you that at the end, what's coming up next. Polly Toynbee and David Walker have written a whole series of books which, in a curious way, have chronicled our political times. And they do it in a unique way. There's a tendency, let me confess, for us political journalists to focus on the personalities. And I do that, I lapse into it, I find them all too fascinating, the tragedy and absurdity of politics. But where they are unique is that they focused on the policy, and they've, in effect, done a unique chronicle through the New Labour era and the coalition in a series of books, and we'll talk about that. And obviously Polly writes twice a week for The Guardian, where she herself has made, I think, her views very clear on the coalition and other matters as well. So we'll be able to explore this period we've been living through in a unique way. So what we'll do is I'll invite them on, I'll speak to them for a bit, and then open it up for questions. And I promise you, you'll get more than 1.5 minutes on the Today programme. So without further more ado, let's please welcome Polly Toynbee and David Walker. Our Michael Parkinson style set. So if it's okay with the two of you, I'll ask you a few questions first, and then we'll open it up, and we can have a wider discussion tonight. Can we begin with the coalition? Because you, as I said in the introduction, have probably analysed its policies more than most. We're fascinated by whether Cameron has fallen out with Clegg and all that, but you, forensically, both of you, focused on policy. And I think in policy terms, you have both concluded, however emollient Cameron appears on the Today programme or on Andrew Marr or whatever, that this is a radical, I think you would say, both of you, a coalition of the radical right, would you say?
I would say that it's a coup, it's a revolution almost. From the Cameron who appeared before the election to the Cameron who appeared afterwards, the shock was quite extraordinary. We had, a man who seemed to understand where he had to position the Tory party, how he had to shed the nasty party image, how he had to vote blue, go green, hug hoodies and huskies. There was, a whole new, and I thought very interesting move, it seemed to be, but it was entirely presentational.
Did you believe for a time? Because there was a period, Cameron was elected in December 2005, and for 2 years he kept on mentioning you, didn't he? And citing you as someone who he kind of felt an affinity with.
It was extraordinary. I appeared on a programme with him, and he said, yes, I agree with what you say. It is absolutely true about inequality that a rising tide doesn't raise all boats. Wealth doesn't trickle down. We have to absolutely focus on the poorest and on inequality itself. He was full of language which you would never hear him say again after that early stage of rebranding the party. Did I believe
him at the time?
Not entirely. I thought this was positioning. I thought this was a much better sort of Conservative party than we'd ever had before. But it was obviously still a Conservative party.
The thing is, though, if you look back and scrape away that surface of politics, and some of you may have heard of a think tank called Policy Exchange.
Yeah.
And if you look at a succession of pamphlets written from 2002 onwards, before Cameron became leader, you can see a lot of the elements of what's become this radical programme. And there's a rather shadowy minister called Oliver Letwin. Again, the name may be familiar to you. He's a Cabinet Office minister. And if you look at succession of speeches which he made in opposition, while the hoodies were being hugged and the Eskimos were being followed on the sledge, Letwin was making speeches which presaged this radical approach.
So in that sense, it was all out there. I mean, you clearly followed the Policy Exchange pamphlets, and Cameron openly admits he was influenced by Policy Exchange. And Oliver Letwin, it's really interesting. I put in endless bids to interview Oliver Letwin, who is a very nice man, isn't he? Whatever his ideological views that you might disagree with, he's never allowed out on camera. He's quite powerful behind the scenes.
He is the great ideologue. He's been put in the Cabinet Office as the driver of ideas and hugely respected. He is totally delightful to meet, utterly charming, but a very strong ideologue of the right, and it's rather odd to sort of combine it with his great niceness. He's actually, one shouldn't necessarily introduce somebody's parentage, but his mother was Shirley Letwin.
Like Paul Dacre has just done.
Paul Dacre has just done, who was a great apostle, sat at the feet of Ayn Rand. It's that strand of really off the scale belief in the power of the individual, red in tooth and claw competition, and the dead hand of the state as always pernicious. So underneath all of that sort of hugely urbane exterior, there really is that strong ideological push, which I think is the thrust behind most of the government. And it's confusing because Cameron seems entirely plausible as a not very ideological chap, quite likeable, quite human, chillaxing. Rather, people think of him as, if anything, a little bit laid back and lazy, not as a swivel-eyed ideologue. He isn't really, but it's more that whole generation has breathed in this stuff. Right from when they were at university, had pictures of Margaret Thatcher on their walls. They felt committed to taking her campaign one stage further, and they have. While she privatised, nationalised industries, they are privatising the state itself. That is their mission. They possibly don't even... Cameron probably doesn't think of himself as
the truth is that changes do go in a number of disparate directions. I'm sorry to be... If I can be... you build this as... you didn't use the word, you're polite, nerds, but let me give you what may seem a slightly nerdish example. We live in London, and we...
Did I call you a nerd? No. Been a slightly unfortunate introduction.
But people tend to think that people who focus on
policy are nerds.
We live in London, and we can see a reduction in the number of Metropolitan Police officers. We can see the interaction between Boris Johnson and the Met Police. Look outside London to the rest of England and Wales, and you will see the creation by the present government of the most politicised form of police management that we have seen since Sir Robert Peel in 1830. And that's not me saying that. You may not... There's a book published actually this week by Oxford University Press by a guy called Tim Bray, who formerly was Chief Constable of Gloucestershire, now gone into academic life. And he used the phrase to me, a revolutionary programme of change. If you take the reduction in the pay and conditions of police officers, the changes in police governments, police and crime commissioners elected locally, and what they've done to the central elements of police, the National Crime Agency they've created, this amounts, he said, to a revolutionary programme. And I think that's further evidence that this government is a very radical enterprise.
It is interesting as well, because around about, I think, the time that your interim book on the coalition came out, another journalist, very sort of mild-mannered chap, Nick Timmins, did one on the NHS, and he described this government as the most radical since 45. So in that sense, he agreed with you. But what I'd be interested to know, obviously the two of you disagree with the ideological push, but do you, we'll come on to New Labour in a minute, which you chronicled in depth, do you kind of admire... I mean, David, you're gripped by ideas, and I know you're frustrated that Labour aren't as gripped as you would like them to be. So on one level, although you disagree with it, do you admire the Letwins and whoever else it is who is pushing this?
Well,
to stick with them. I mean, they didn't even win the election with an overall majority, and they, if you are right, are pushing their ideas way beyond what Labour did when they had majorities of 180. So on one level, do you kind of admire this?
Steve is a great mimic. You've seen some of that already. Just before we came on, we were talking about an event featuring, of all people, Tony Blair. And Blair apparently was sort of saying, you've really got to stamp your authority as a government in the first 12 months. There's no question this lot have been amazingly effective at pushing through radical change very, very quickly. Here we are barely 3 years after they came to power, and their major legislation is in place. The fiscal cuts and then the legislation affecting social policy, the police, welfare, education, they got it done remarkably quickly. As a political operation, you have to be somewhat admiring of the speed and effectiveness with which they've delivered their programme.
But not for nothing was our little intro book. We're writing a book on the 5 years. We hope it's a complete 5 years that will be an entity in itself, not to be repeated. But our interim book was called Dogma and Disarray, and we've talked about the dogma. And certainly that dogma drove them on, hit the ground running on health, on education, getting the legislation through, knowing what they wanted. But the other side of it was disarray, was their incapacity to understand how you actually make things work, and not really caring in a way. And in some sense, by despising the state so much, they hardly minded if it all didn't work very well. It simply added to the evidence, well, the NHS is broke, isn't it? It doesn't work, does it? So that fragmentation and destruction and disarray was almost built into the plan. But they were certainly very bad at it, and they've made a huge number of mistakes all along the way in which they've tripped over their own plans by getting things wrong, by not understanding, by not studying the detail, and by despising the state and therefore its levers and what makes things work.
Except now, David, the economy's growing, unemployment is falling. It looks as if by the time of the election, the economy could be growing more than it is now.
But you are sufficient in command of the figures to know that the rate of growth, the present rate of growth of the UK economy is going to take how many years to get back to the levels we were at in 2008 when the crash occurred. So yes, you're right, there is growth, but we're still considerably, as an economy, below the level we were at 5, 6 years ago.
That's the question.
And then there's a question of distribution. Yes.
Who feels
Who feels it? Bits of London feel it. Some homeowners in London feel it. Off again. Anybody you hear who owns a home in London, astounded, particularly if you're, our age, astounded at what's happened to insane wealth for doing nothing. At one point, actually, prices of property rising by £50 a day while you were out at work. Madness. All of that coming back again. But this time people know. They know it's fairy money. They know it's not.
Well, I think behind Steve's question, I wouldn't accuse you of cynicism, but maybe enough of our fellow citizens will believe that the feel-good music they hear from politicians, that they read in the Evening Standard, they read in blogs on the internet, maybe they'll believe that, rather than the daily experience they have.
So you think your 5-year book might have to be a 10-year?
I think outside London, we have to remember, and we travel outside of London a lot and go to places that meet lots of other people in other places. I think there is a real sense of, I don't see any of this around here. Nothing much is happening. The employment market doesn't feel good. Technically, people are in part-time jobs, very insecure, very low paid, just about topped up with now reduced tax credits. I don't think they're going to be feeling good by 2015. Maybe the government can persuade people to look at the idea, at the future. Look, this is the trajectory we're on, don't let Labour ruin it, rather than how people actually feel now. But I don't think they'll be feeling any better.
So if we'll look back and then come to Ed Miliband and Labour in a second. You don't think, it's interesting, a lot of people who do not approve of this government think it's quite likely that they will win. And they, as in the Conservatives, you don't think that's likely?
I still think it's less likely. I don't think it's impossible. But when you look at the mountains they have to climb, when you look at the very good polling done by the now wonderful Lord Ashcroft, we all love him now because he does this fantastic polling in the 40 key marginals. The 40 key marginals are much more Labour than the overall polls. The 40 key marginals do not look as if they're about to go Tory. I think that when you look at, if Cameron, at his most ebullient, most charming, fresh, new, different, non-nasty party, couldn't beat Gordon Brown, the most despised of prime ministers in our lifetime, how on earth is he going to do better next time? Well, I mean, he could mathematically, nobody knows how the Lib Dem votes will fall out. And it's difficult to calculate that. I mean, I think they'll probably hold on to a lot of their seats fairly well. They may lose their seats that are the third of seats that are Labour-facing, but they'll probably hang on to their Tory-facing seats, or they have a good chance of doing that. So it all depends. But if, of course, they were to collapse altogether, the Tories might well win all of their seats, and that would be a disaster for Labour. So it partly depends on Ed Miliband being able to send a dog whistle message to Labour voters in those southwestern, always be Lib Dem seats. Please keep giving your votes to the Lib Dems. But that's kind of a difficult message.
Quite a difficult message, yeah.
While you're trying to fight
Ed Miliband vote Lib Dem is going to be an interesting one.
Someone quit the other day, sorry, I have to get this one out, apropos of a rather sad failed pregnancy at Edinburgh Zoo. There are more giant pandas in Scotland than there are Tory MPs. However, there are parts of England, not too far from here, where the Labour representation is pretty marginal or non-existent. And the idea that Labour would come back enough in such areas, London suburbs, Surrey, the rest of the south east, East Anglia, where Labour's representation is very poor, it's a huge mountain to climb. Places like Southampton, where Labour sort of clung on in 2010, whether they would push further forward, it's a big ask.
Yeah. What's interesting?
But that's what you think
about the next election.
Yes. What's your hunch? What are
My
you feeling
hunch,
now?
if I had to put a bet on it, it will be another hum with Labour, the biggest party.
That's what I would bet.
And I think it's quite a good bet, that one. I mean, you wouldn't make much money out of it because I think the bookmakers think it's a good bet as well.
Actually, it's not with the bookmakers.
No, that Labour's a favourite to win an overall.
Yes, and Labour's a heavy favourite to win overall, and you get rather good odds on a Labour-hung parliament.
See, one of the things we'll discuss in a minute, and you might want to raise this as well, is whether newspapers are still powerful. I think they are, and they are going to go for Miliband big time.
Good. They have
already, but I think there'll be much, much more to come. And so I think the economy growing, the newspapers being as ferocious as 92, and maybe we can explain later why I think newspapers are still powerful, even though nobody reads them. It's a weird thing, or buys them. I think that will help Cameron. There's also two things have happened, which is quite interesting about politics as magicians. We've been talking a lot about policy and ideas. I think we're in quite a weak generation of politicians, actually. We haven't got giants like we were talking earlier
Sure,
about.
it's not just that we're getting old.
No. I think the 70s and 80s there were bigger figures. But two things have happened which have been amazing. I don't quite know how they pulled them off. George Osborne, who I don't rate as a strategist, I don't know what you think on those sort of low-level terms, did one clever thing, which he seems to have convinced voters that the entire global economic crisis was down to Ed Balls. Collapse of Lehman Brothers in the United States, Ed Balls. Kind of the collapse of the Spanish banks, Ed Balls. I don't know how he did it, but the polls suggest that is the view. I don't know. Anyway, that was very clever and difficult for Labour, as you've written and we've discussed many times. The clever thing that Labour have done is I always wondered, although Miliband and Balls never said there would be a recession by the time of the next election, I always wondered how they would deal with when the economy started to grow. And brilliantly, they've turned it completely into a cost of living thing. And so the Tories have got no benefit so far from the growing economy. And I think those acts were very, very clever, and they sort of cancel each other out.
It's
and I think
true,
it's another reason
but
why it's
it's
going to be
tricky.
quite close.
I think there is a problem with the energy. People are very angry with energy companies. They think Labour's absolutely right about it. But it doesn't help underpin a sense of trust in Labour's economic judgment. I think it also remains a sense of, well, it's the kind of thing Labour would do, isn't it? Are they really responsible? Is this slightly irresponsible?
Oh, so you're a bit of a sceptic on the price freeze.
Well, I think it's a good thing to have done because it's been a great sort of political coup. But it does appear still that the trust in Labour as stewards of the economy is still quite low. They've still got a lot they've got to make up on that, despite the fact that they've said, you know, they will stick to the spending envelope in the first year, and they will stick to the benefit bill over a period of, I think, 5 years. They won't allow it to rise. Those are quite tough pledges to have made, and they don't seem to have had very much impact. We've got the pain without the gain. That's
very interesting that you'll have some doubts about the price freeze and the politics of it, because it seems to be working for it, but maybe there will be longer. Could I ask you briefly about New Labour? Because I remember, David, somebody reviewing your final book, The Verdict. Polly and David did a whole series of books in the New Labour period, because that did go on for years and years. And I remember a reviewer saying that although you don't focus on the soap opera of politics that some of us lapse into occasionally, it was like kind of reading a terrible disillusionment. You start quite excited in 97, and by the end, just by following the policy development, you are deeply, deeply disillusioned. Is that a fair summary of your deep assessment of that period, your emotional reaction to it, having studied all those policies?
Yes, but I think it also reflected, if one's candid, a kind of personal problem, which is whether our country, and our country can be defined as England and Wales, United Kingdom, ever wants to have radical change of a centre-left kind. Whether there exists in our country the solidarity that will be needed to underpin a fairer distribution of income, a more progressive tax system.
Well, that's interesting.
And yes, I mean, one was tempted to sort of say, yes, the Labour should have been much more, should have had much more faith in the capacity of British people, English people, to support this. But when it came to it, Tony Blair's caution, and he was a man who lapped up opinion polls, he did focus groups time after time, and they came back to him consistently saying, people are not particularly progressive. So maybe part of our problem at the end of that era was a lack of faith. And Polly and I disagree perhaps about this.
Well, no, we disagreed. We kind of zigzagged. We would say, you know, just imagine what Tony Blair could have done with the power and the charisma and the influence he had, if only he'd been willing to lead public opinion instead of following the opinion polls, following the focus groups. Just think what he might have done. And then you have moments of panic and you think, maybe he was right. You know, maybe this country just won't be pushed that much further to the left, and maybe Labour will now lose and lose and lose again until it goes back onto the Tony Blair path. And there is no resolution to that. There is a hope and aspiration that a charismatic leader could persuade people, because everybody is torn between right-wing sentiments and left-wing sentiments, and in a sense it takes a great convincing leader to bring out in people the sense of collective endeavour and the benefits of collective endeavour and the good the state can do, and taxation as the price of civilization, and all of those thoughts. You know, the Olympic opening ceremony, if you like, which touched hearts right across the spectrum. Couldn't Tony Blair have done that? The answer is that we'll never know. One thing, we were fairly positive in that book. I mean, that book is not by any means...
No, it's not.
It's not. We wanted it to be there, knowing that Labour would lose, as a record of all Labour had done that was good. You know, whether it was Sure Start, whether it was for the first time in NHS with no waiting lists and with the highest satisfaction rates ever, going all the way through all of the social policies, immense improvement. Free nursery education for the first time, huge improvement in schools and education. You know, it's nonsense to say that was just, exam grade slippage. Might have been a bit of that. but it doesn't explain the huge success. For instance, London schools having immensely improved through the London Challenge. And we wanted to record all that and say the money was not wasted. It did good. And now the government says, oh, well, you know, it was all... Labour just sort of threw the money away. It's a bit depressing to have Tony Blair...
But you have to add... you have to add to that two things. One, despite having been in power for... how many years were they in power? 11, 12, 13 years. They didn't really touch fundamental questions. Productivity... the balance of the economy, imbalances between the prosperous south, east and the north, transport infrastructure, and then a whole class of issues which they bequeathed, in a sense, themselves as a toxic legacy. And I'm afraid the first of those was migration and people's sense in many parts of the country that something had happened that they did not like. And we may want to talk about this in more detail, but I mean, the woman, what was the woman's name in Burnley? Gordon Brown's...
Rochdale.
Anyway,
during the election.
That captured a problem for Labour. And it's still bubbling away for Labour as an issue, as well as, obviously, for the present government.
Yeah. What about Ed Miliband? I mean, if you and David are right to doubt whether England will ever chime with your hopes, Ed Miliband is clearly to the left of Tony Blair and that whole new Labour period that you chronicled. Do you think that is a very precarious position for someone to be in, even if it moves Labour closer to what perhaps the two of you hoped New Labour would do? Or do you think, well, what about
I think the positions he laid out have been very clever, very good, and on the whole popular. You know, I think to go for housing and jobs, you know, 1 million houses, and everybody who's been, all the long-term unemployed, guaranteed minimum wage jobs, not slave labour, proper minimum wage jobs, phenomenally popular and really seriously economically important and the right thing to do. I think that, you know, I think what he's done about saying, you know, you should break up the energy cartels, absolutely right. I think he has put a foot wrong in terms of policy. There just seems to be... I like him very much and think he's thoroughly decent, clever, you know, possibly too nice to be that kind of politician, I don't know, but he is a nice guy. But so far, I'm afraid, doesn't quite have the heft, the political weight to carry all of those ideas forward. And he hasn't really managed to sell them. They're very sellable, but he hasn't really managed to sell them. We haven't got a sense of a phalanx of a team behind him, right there behind him, to push forward all those ideas every time he brings them forward. They go forward, you think, yes, and then it kind of fritters away. So that I don't think either the 1 million houses or a job guarantee are cemented into the public imagination at all. People are asked, what does he stand for? Energy policy is the only thing, probably, that they would remember.
Yeah. What do you think, David? Given that you said, you know, maybe on reflection, your disillusionment was your personal disillusionment, whereas in fact maybe Blair got the country right. What about Miliband?
I mean, it would be extraordinary if, after the catastrophe in the capitalist system in 2007, 8, 9, the aspirant leader of the country for the Labour Party wasn't somewhat to the left of his predecessors, Gordon Brown and Tony Blair. And you don't have to be a Marxist, you don't have to be a strong critic of capitalism to see that there is something fundamentally wrong in the balance between the financial sector and production and services, in the constitution of banks, in the way that corporate boards operate, in the balance of trade, where we became so dependent on financial services. Any leader of the Labour Party would have to respond to that, not least the son of someone, Ralph Miliband, who had a worked-out critique of the capitalist system. That's in the past. But his son at least came to high office with the capacity to think about a system which, in those years, at the end of the last decade, fell apart. So I think if he wasn't slightly left-wing, we'd have a major, major problem. At a time when, I mean, you may pick this up, some of you, I mean, the Nobel Prize for Economics was awarded by the Swedish Academy 3 weeks ago. And there was a huge fuss because two of the recipients were American academic economists whose work had been basically, and I simplify slightly, saying, in all markets, everything is perfect. In the stock market, everything is perfect. And they got a Nobel Prize for saying something that's palpably untrue. It was untrue prior to 2008, and it's certainly visibly untrue since. So I think we need somebody like Miliband who's at least prepared to think a bit more about the system which fell apart.
That's interesting. Probably kind of finally, and then we're going to open it up to a wider discussion. This is sort of journalists on stage. And journalism is very interesting. I'm going to ask Mihir Bose. He's here tomorrow, the sports editor of the BBC, as was. And it's really interesting. Sports journalists have to be so polite to sports people, you know. And political journalists are often criticised for being too soft on politicians. Could I ask you, Polly, I mean, we mentioned earlier how Cameron wooed you early on. And you could have decided... No, it didn't win you, but he wooed you. You could have decided, God, this is such brilliant access. I will, you know, give him quite a lot of space here. But clearly you did. You decided, you took a view on him and have gone for him in your columns and the coalition more generally. Presumably, that's at a cost to access. It's one of the things columnists have to calculate all the time. I mean, we were in quite a lot seeing Blair, Brown and all that during that era. Presumably that doesn't happen now. You don't get calls from Cameron saying, I really liked you saying I'm, you know, terrible.
I'm afraid I have not set foot in Downing Street since this regime took over.
And journalistically, does that worry you at all, or do you just think, as columnists, it's beyond that sort of calculation?
I think not really, no. because I came into political journalism a different route to most political journalists. You know, start off as sort of apprentices in Westminster. I had nothing to do with Westminster. I came from writing about social policy, and then from being the BBC's social affairs editor, covering health and social security and education and all of those issues, and then arrived as a political columnist in, first of all, briefly in The Independent and then in The Guardian. Before, when I was in The Guardian, I'd been on the women's page, but writing very much social policy. And so I came in sort of through the back door, and I was interested in politics, really in terms of outcomes. What does it achieve? What does it do? What does this bill mean? Whereas most of the people who were in the lobby, and I've never been in the lobby, were saying, what does this mean for the cabals groups within that party? Who's up, who's down? What does it mean about trouncing the opposition or trouncing the government? Using policy as if it were just a weapon of war, as opposed to the fact this actually has real outcomes on real people. What kind of laws you pass, how you distribute the money in a budget really matters to real people. And that's what's really interested me, is the outcomes. And in a sense, the books that we did 3 books on Labour after each of their term, first term, second term, third term, to see, well, what has been the outcome? What have they achieved? Have they achieved as much as they've promised? Where has it been good? Where has it failed? What's worked? What hasn't? And in the end, that's what really matters about politics. So, of course, I'm absolutely fascinated and obsessed with the gossip of what goes on. There's not much point in me talking to Tories, because they will talk to me, but all I'll get is the press release coming out of their mouth. They're not going to trust me. Why should they? To say anything that they wouldn't say on the 9 or on the 10 o'clock news. So there's no point in me talking to them, really. I want to see what they do. I want to see where the money goes. I want to see what their legislation will happen. I want to see what happens in the health services. It's now fragmenting badly. There's no particular point in me talking to Jeremy Hunt, and he wouldn't say anything to me. He probably wouldn't talk to me. The DWP has now stopped speaking to me altogether. They won't even answer my calls. And then they write letters, indignant letters, saying, I've got it all wrong. And so we go forwards and backwards. I mean, I think, Ian Duncan-Smith, there'd be no point in me speaking to him at all. I have interviewed him a lot on his sort of way up and when he first arrived in power. But there's no point. He just lies. He lies and lies and lies. I have seen, Ian Duncan-Smith, Grant Shapps, some of them, I have never seen politicians look you in the eye and lie the way they do and say that black is white. Produce figures that are rubbish, that have been proved to be rubbish, and sometimes taken up by the chief statistician, who says that is not true. It is not true that the NHS is having extra money, and they still say it, and they don't care.
And actually, Ian Douglas Smith is here tonight. That's what
oh, do let's.
Right, let's... what's the time? God, blimey, yeah. Let's widen it out now for discussion, which is what I said at the beginning. Can we have some lights so we can see things? Right, okay. Right, so I think the best way of doing it, if 2 or 3 perhaps could ask questions briefly or raise or make points, and then we'll come back to the discussion here. So who would like to ask? Sorry, I can't. Yes.
Yeah. You're talking about the whether or not Labour can come to power, etc. But I mean, what isn't the real sort of problem is that since the coalition came to power, from day one, they've been talking about the mess the previous government got us into. Ed Miliband, whoever else, Ed Balls, could have repudiated that. They never have. Isn't that a big problem? Second problem, this thing that Boris came up with about Ed stabbing David in the back. How did he get over that? Third problem, I think the Labour front bench is weak.
Right, as you've raised 3 points, and there's 3 of us, why don't we each do 1 each? Polly, why don't you do, is the front bench weak? Because I know you spent quite a lot of time with some of them recently. And then I'll do the recent past. Could you do, what was the 3rd point?
The brothers.
Are you up for the brothers? Or do you want to do the recent past? Anyway, what about the front? Because you've been dealing with Rachel Reeves.
I think it's true, because the trouble is it better to have a front bench of people who are contaminated with the past, or a front bench that is young and inexperienced and people who don't know very well? And it's tricky, because in Ed Balls you've got somebody who has a lot of past baggage with him. On the other hand, he's very experienced. You would trust him to know how to deal with the Treasury because he knows it inside out. Once he was there, I mean, I don't think he's particularly radical in his thinking, but he would be a very competent Chancellor. But on the other hand, he carries an awful lot of baggage with him. We have a lot of very good, bright new people who've only come in recently, whether it's Tristram Hunt, whether it's Rachel Reeves, whether it's Chuka. You've got people coming up like Stella Creasy, like Mary Cray, amazingly good women, and they really are good. But it does take time to get a political reputation. I mean, when you said, the giants were all in the past, I wonder whether they really seemed giants at the time. And you look back and say, the days of Crossman and Crossland, and I'm not sure they seemed so gigantic at the time. I mean, I was very young then looking at them, but I think there is always a tendency one has to aim off for saying, when we were young, we looked up at these figures of authority, and now the politicians seem incredible, and of course are younger than they were. That's the other thing. They have served less of an apprenticeship, and it possibly does mean they carry less authority. But I am very encouraged by their calibre. And if they can only get it together in the next 18 months to seem coherent and to seem like a group that's well knitted together, they're an attractive proposition, I think.
Do you mind if I answer the recent past one? Because I'm obsessed by this. And David, you can go for that one if you don't want to answer the regicide accusation.
Fratricide.
But fratricide.
He's not good about his father.
Yeah. I agree with you. I think this is so dangerous. Some of you, most of you far too young, but some of you will remember the 1992 election, where the Conservatives were still playing back images of the so-called winter of discontent in '79. They were still using the recent past to destroy any hope of that Labour Party winning in '92. And it's a real example. On the whole, people think of politicians as mighty and arrogant, and I read quite a lot that Ed Balls is this arrogant bully. They are too scared to go onto this terrain of the recent past. The focus groups tell them that they are blamed for the crash, that Gordon Brown is toxic, that they are seen as the sons of Gordon Brown, and so they don't dare go there. And lots of people, from Alistair Campbell to Jack Straw to others, say, we did some good things, as Polly and David have outlined here and in their book. say that we did some good things and that the economy was recovering by 2010. They're too scared to go there. They think if they go there, they will be swallowed alive. But I think, and it's one of the reasons why I don't think they can win next time, because they have lost the battle over the recent past. So I think you're really right to raise it. David, you
asked about
and then I think
Johnson and allegations about fratricidal behaviour between the two Miliband's. Not long after I got to know Polly, she confessed that she had seen Boris Johnson's penis. And I had
no idea that the evening was going to...
Utterly taken back. It transpired earlier in her life she'd known Boris's mother. And
he was 6 months
seen
old.
This
and he looked exactly the same, a big fat pink thing with the chocolate lying on a bar.
I thought David had given us the story of the night.
The point is the Johnson family is a far from functional entity. And I think the serious point is if Labour politicians were slightly less restrained, were maybe slightly more cynical, they could give as good as they get from the likes of Boris Johnson. Let's remember the father-in-law of the Chancellor of the Exchequer is a man who believes that you should go fracking under the city of Durham and Newcastle because there is only a wasteland in the north of England. And Labour might point out that if you have a mad father-in-law, your family has major problems. So I think there are things that Labour could do to respond to that. And I think people don't particularly rate that kind of cheap shot from Johnson.
Okay, thank you. The guy hides quite hard. Yeah, but in the stripe, I think it's a striped jumper. Yeah, and then we'll go back there and then over to this side. Yeah.
I'd be interested to hear the panel's views on press control, because next week, going through Parliament is a press control bill, which they think will get passed. Now, behind the scenes, all the press barons, they're going to set up their own cosy club, and are they going to refuse to adhere to the new parliamentary bill then? What will happen?
Can we just take a couple more, because that means we'll get everyone. The guy behind, and then we'll come over to this side. Yeah.
One of the things that you haven't talked about at all is UKIP, and I think that the relationship between them and the Tories is something that will have quite an impact in the next election. So
Okay.
I'd like to hear
Press control, UKIP, and
Yeah, I mean, a lot of times I talk to my mates about politics, and I'm 23, and a lot of them feel very sort of out of touch with politics and feel it's totally distant to them. And I think it's got a lot to do with my lack of education in politics, sort of all throughout years, and nothing in A-levels unless you actually specifically choose to go with that. And I think people are looking a little bit towards left, but not seeing anything but Labour, but associate Labour with sort of the Blair years. Do you think there's any sort of progress that could go?
Yeah. Do some of them talk approvingly of the Russell Brand stuff?
Well, yeah, I mean, that does spark a lot of conversation.
Quite dangerous, Russell Brand, I think, in terms of being anti-politics.
I think he could have done a bit more of his research beforehand. But especially with sort of not voting, if you totally disagree, then maybe spoil your ballot, maybe. But I mean, he did highlight on a lot of things that people it's ignored in the media, sort of thing, like the corporations and so how many problems we actually have in society.
Yeah. Press regulation, Polly, I mean, where do you stand and the Guardian stand, given that you really, the Guardian started this whole thing going with the hacking?
Unless you are an obsessive, you will probably by now have lost your way in where all of this has gone, because it is incredibly difficult, very intricate. I think the best rule of thumb is to say wherever Murdoch is, that's where not to be. And you won't go too wrong with that. So that's the first thing. I mean, so there are Dacre and Murdoch. Dacre, who is, after all, thinks there was nothing wrong with the Press Complaints Commission, of which he was the chair of the Press Code Ethics Committee. So he thought that was fine. And they think that essentially they should still control a new body. They would at least have, I mean, they'd control it a little bit less than they did, but they would have a right of veto about who sat on it. And they want their own person, Lord Black, Guy Black, who ran the previous one, to be on it. And they really want to control it. And they present it as if, if they don't control it, then the wicked state controls it. it's complicated because, then in came Oliver Letwin with the very bright idea of having a royal charter, which has complicated the whole thing. It's at several removes from political control, but there is still, a slight thread of what could be political control. If 2/3 of Parliament wanted to change the royal charter, they could, and that could influence a new body. There is going to be a body in between, which is the recognition body, which will then recognise or not recognise the new regulator. The Guardian is sitting uncomfortably watching this, not much liking the Royal Charter, certainly not liking the press's own lot. The Independent, the FT are also sort of dithering somewhere in the middle. The Guardian goes on, I think Alan Rusbridge is being a bit optimistic, saying he thinks there will be a compromise. I am not so sure. But the real bite in this is that if the main part of the press don't join a regulator that gets the Royal Charter's recognition body's recognition, if they then have a big libel suit or a big, phone hacking, the damages they could pay would be extraordinary, huge punitive damages. So the temptation, particularly for the local press and other people who've not got any money these days, to say, well, perhaps we ought to come into something that is authorised so that we are protected from these punitive damages, may swing them round, but people are so entrenched. What do you think? Do you think it's going to get solved?
I can't see a way through it. I mean, I don't know where you are personally, but I'm personally entirely relaxed about this form of, it is statutory actually. I don't see who else enforces or shapes the kind of mechanism whereby people get a right to redress, other than, in the end, elected politicians, however uneasy that makes some people feel. But I'm in a real minority amongst journalists. I mean, these editors seem to be insisting that if it goes ahead, they won't follow it. One or two have said they're happy to go to jail. Well, actually, they're not happy.
They're all longing to go to jail.
They're all longing to go to jail.
But that's not what happens. They'll just get swinging great fines.
Exactly. It seems to me that the scale of revelations about what newspapers got up to means that people need some kind of legal redress in terms of rights of reply, and it needs some mechanism to enforce it. And if it's voluntary, we know what happens, nothing. But I'm in a real minority.
You are in a minority, and it was a slight shock to The Guardian when, because it's got very intertwined with the whole Philip Snowden thing. The editor of the New York Times.
Edward Snowden.
Sorry, Edward Snowden. Sorry,
Philip Snowden, another bad
somebody else. The editor of the New York Times came to talk to us the other day. We've been working very closely with them over the Snowden revelations, and she came to talk to us. And, she was saying how she could not understand how the rest of the press in Britain had absolutely not taken this up at all. And they just said, the Guardian's, put our national security at jeopardy. And that's simply their revenge on us. Partly they're jealous because they didn't get it. And their revenge on us over the whole Leveson thing and the fact that we exposed the phone hacking. And they keep saying, we're quite happy to see journalists going to jail for phone hacking. So why shouldn't they go to jail for their breach of security? This is madness. Yeah. The equivalence of these two things is insane.
Mad.
But when the editor came, Jill Abramson, she said, well, frankly, you've got yourself in trouble here because we in America cannot understand how you could have any form of regulation of the press. Our First Amendment simply does not allow it. We have nothing of the kind. We wouldn't even begin to tolerate it. So we don't really understand where you, The Guardian, are on this.
That's interesting.
So there's, there are very complicated threads here. But essentially, I think we probably will accept the Royal Commission, but we didn't want to end up being a royal charter which only regulated The Guardian.
David, a lot of people, I think Polly and I both said we think the next election could well be another hung parliament. I don't know whether you agree with that, but do you agree with the idea that UKIP is the great wild card and could do for Cameron, so you don't have to do another 5-year book on him?
Well, I don't know, but there is no question. I mean, we're on the left, and we sort of want to see the Tories as a unified and strong force. In fact, behind the surface, as UKIP exposes, it is deeply riven. And to state the blindingly obvious, Europe is the issue which would, even perhaps before the next election, do for David Cameron. Feelings run so strongly among certain sections of Tory backbenchers that, I mean, we've seen the argument about when and if a referendum before the election and a referendum afterwards. The issue of Europe, which clearly is the central issue of the UKIP, we could see a Tory government win the most seats in the House of Commons and effectively be unable to govern because of the European issue. And so obviously the strength that UKIP would get in terms of seats or electoral presence would have a bearing on the Tories' existence as a political party.
But here's the real irony on Europe, which is painful, is that, and this is why Labour must not promise a referendum, because if we think that Labour's quite likely to be the largest party, if there had to be a referendum, because Labour had been foolish enough in a panic before the election to say, oh, it sounds so undemocratic, we must give people a vote, I think they should say, you have a vote in the election. If you want to be out of Europe, vote for UKIP. If you're pro-European, vote Labour. And they should just be open about that and say it's not about a referendum, that's madness. But supposing Labour were to give in to that, which they might, there's quite a strong Labour contingent who want to, became the biggest party, 2 years later had to have a referendum, they would lose it. They would be not very strong government anyway. By then the Tory party would have gone entirely mad and totally Eurosceptic and absolutely out now, with a huge campaign behind them. And Labour would be very weak, and I think they'd lose it, and Labour would then have to step down.
Would you mind asking the audience whether they think we should have a referendum?
Yeah.
On the straight in-out question. That opinion has moved since 1975, and we are at a position as a country, leave Scotland out of it, when we should have a choice.
Okay.
A choice.
Let's do two questions. Should there be a referendum in-out? And then I'll ask you how you would vote in it, if you don't mind. But should there be an in-out referendum after the next general election? Whoever wins.
Before the election.
Okay, should there be should there be an in-out referendum on Europe? Who thinks there should be? Right, a minority. I think we might have what's called an unrepresentative. who thinks there should not be a referendum at all? Blimey, right.
That is very unrepresentative, because on the whole, if you ask any group of pollsters, ask anyone, do you want a referendum on anything at all? They always say yes. So it's rare not to want to be asked.
Right, I really want to bring in the others, but you asked about the anti-politics thing of your friends and things. I think we can say something that no politician can, that to some extent, I think your friends are being a bit unfair on them. Because even what they need to do, and what a lot of people need to do, is look at sometimes the context in which they operate, these politicians. And when they do, they'll be quite reassured in a way, I think. So they'll all think they're just in it for themselves, and they're all just scheming all the time. But even if you take Cameron and Osborne the last few days over fuel prices, it's a nightmare for them. They totally disapprove of Miliband's price freeze. And a lot of their talk would have been on the issue. So what the hell do? We disapprove of interfering in markets. But hold on, we cannot go to the next election letting him offer a price freeze. So what are we going to do? And then they look at green taxes. And then Cameron said, well, I'm meant to be the Green Prime Minister. What do I do? And Osborne will say, but it's the only option to cut bills, to compete with Miliband. And so the conversation they would have about these things will be quite substantial. It will be real. It will be the conversations your friends are happening. And even with Blair and Brown, you probably all despaired, those of you old enough to remember the Blair-Brown era. I always forget, it's years ago now, where everyone was saying it was all about the soap opera. Brown wanted the job, Blair was just interested in keeping the job. Most of their conversations, when they were talking about public service reform, Blair would say, look, free up the hospitals, and Brown would say, look, they'll all go, we can't let a hospital go bust. And they were talking about real issues that your mates will be talking about. But the tragedy and danger is the disconnect. No, your friends don't realise those conversations are happening, and politicians have failed to find a way of conveying the fact that they're not these complete weirdos on another planet, and it's really dangerous.
If you come back on Saturday, hear his show, you will hear one of the best defences of why politics is worthwhile. why it's about real things, why it matters, why most of the people, even if we disagree with them passionately, are not in it for themselves, and most of them could probably be earning more doing something somewhere else. They may be in it for the love of the game, but they're also in it, go into it on the whole, they think they want to get things changed in the direction they want to move things. I think it is very difficult. Why you very rarely get a one-term parliament is that it's, you know, the memory is so fresh for the young, for yourself, of Labour as the establishment, that in a sense you get a change of government when the anti-establishment party comes in. And it's quite hard for Labour, even though it's got lots of fresh faces, to present itself as the outsiders, the insurgents. American presidential elections are always the outsider coming to Washington and knocking the establishment out. And Labour can't quite get away with that. So for the young, it looks like two lots of establishment bodies. None of them look that radical. You know, you can see why the young don't want to sign up for something as established as one of the 2 or 2.5 conventional parties. But it doesn't matter. It makes a huge difference who wins next time. If the Tories win next time, it really will be the end of the NHS, probably the end of the BBC as we know it. If they were to win outright, without, you know, or a tiny bit of Lib Demery, but not much, there will be nothing to stop them doing something which we can see them doing now, which would be far more radical. You know, a lot of the privatisation of chains of schools would be allowed to be run by private companies. They are very, very ideological, and I don't think there'll be any repairing what they will have done at the end of 10 years.
Okay,
so get them all out there.
Let's just, the lady at the front here, and then we'll go to the back here. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm really surprised at the attitude, really, of all three of you about, unless I've got it wrong, that you feel that the Labour leadership is afraid to talk about the positive things that they did. And don't you agree that if they had done, then more people would be supporting Labour, and if they had done even more and challenged the system as it was, and challenged the Tories, for instance, on things that would be popular, most people now want to see renationalisation of the railways. Just to mention one thing, I'm sure, I haven't got figures to prove this, but there are polls that say that, but I'm sure that most people would respond now to renationalisation of this whole energy thing. And certainly 70% of the people of this country believe that we are wasting money, £100 billion, on renewing the Trident nuclear submarine. And the last thing I'm going to mention is the fact that one trade union in particular, the PCS, produced a really interesting pamphlet showing how much could be saved and what contribution that could make to the economy. One, if Trident was not renewed, and secondly, if there was a more aggressive policy towards bringing in all the avoided and evaded tax. Now, it's my feeling that if Ed Miliband was to come out strongly on all these issues, as well as on the things that you mentioned, the things that they have done which are positive, then there would be a tremendous rallying for Labour. And that's what most of us want, I think.
Could I just ask you before I will go up there and then I'll bring Polly and David in, do you think at all that you know what would happen? He would be portrayed as Red Ed if he did all those things.
He is anyway.
He is anyway. So you don't think there would be any electoral... Obviously you would like him to do that, but you don't see any electoral risks, only benefits in him doing that?
Because I think, well, obviously you can't say for sure, but I'm certain that there would be a rallying of support, people would be more active, and then he would have the strength of the movement behind him.
Yeah, and of course if you don't do it in opposition, you can't then do it in power. If you haven't laid the arguments out, all oppositions find this. If they haven't been brave in opposition,
but one of the problems I've found with working...
sorry, do you mind? Because there are a couple... We're running out of time. There are quite a few others. The lady at the end and then you at the back, and then we'll bring Polly and David back in.
I'm asking this because you know a hell of a lot more than I do about who's coming up with policy ideas. Who is out there who is thinking about policy longer term as the economic power goes to Asia Pac, shouldn't we be planning to be a declining economy rather than a growing one overall?
Right.
And how are politicians going to sell that to us?
I was going to say, yeah, that is one of the issues, isn't it? Right.
Yeah, it is.
I want us to decline, vote me. And at the back, I'll bring Polly to. Yeah.
Would Scotland, do you think, be better as an independent country led by a Labour government, or remaining as part of the UK with a Conservative government?
You're obviously from Scotland, don't you? What do you think?
I think it would be better as an independent country.
Right, so you support independence. Okay, David, you were saying earlier that you would have liked New Labour to be more radical, but wondered if they had done whether they would win elections. Would you like Ed Miliband to put the case for the state ownership of the energy companies, railways, and I think, what was your third point? Trident.
Well, I mean, there are 2 points. One, they could still do a better job of extolling what they did accomplish between 1997 and 2010. 6 months ago, a team of academics from the London School of Economics, led by John Hills, produced a tremendous report which said, yes, they had improved the life chances of children through Sure Start. Yes, there had been increased educational attainment because more had been spent on schools. Yes, I mean, crime's a complex thing, but there had been beneficial effects on sort of antisocial behaviour through their police policies. Very little of that has been said, articulated by Labour leaders themselves, and that they could do a lot more about that. As far as the present conundrum goes, you don't even have to go as far as saying we're going to renationalise the railways. As you know, there are contracts let to rail companies. At the moment, until maybe next week, a state-owned entity is doing a tremendous job providing rail service on the East Coast Line. Anyone looking at the system in a disinterested way would say it would be great to have some built-in competition between government-owned entities and private sector, and maybe a mutual, and we can actually see how it works and compare and contrast. Similarly in energy, maybe we should do more. It exists to some extent in water, where Welsh Water is a mutual. Why not have a publicly owned water system, maybe here in Thames Water, and compare and contrast how it works relative to a private sector one, in terms of how it borrows money, how it carries forward investment. And that perhaps would save us all as payers of rates to Thames Water having to pay this huge additional sum they're trying to charge us for the super sewer, which some people say is not necessary. So I think, not going even as far as sort of complete nationalisation packages, a greater faith in government's capacity could lead to a system in utilities that was much more effective than the one we've got.
Okay, Polly, I suppose you were implying basically the case for environmental change needs to be put, and simpler lives which will not relate necessarily to the economic growth figures.
Yes, pretty much.
Do you think there is an agenda here?
I think you could not possibly run an election on Vote For Us, Let's Grow Less. I think it's a non-starter. I think you could only imagine that in a country that was very equal. One of the things about growth is that it does, to some extent, cover up, though much less than it did, the huge inequality. I mean, actually, now you could say, well, what's the point of growth when all of the growth happens in the top half and most of it in the top 10%? None of the growth since 2003 has affected the incomes of the bottom half of the population. Nearly all of them in work and gaining nothing. Growth has done no good to them. What growth? I think it seems to me that the much more productive thing for Labour to say is, whose growth is it anyway? Do you really feel this? Is it for you? Look at charts which will show how much of it keeps being sucked up to the top. I mean, I think you should give them a little bit more credit. The mansion tax, bankers' bonuses to be taxed to pay for the job scheme for the long-term unemployed. I think those things are really quite radical. I mean, there's no way that Blair and Brown would have gone for a mansion tax or for a banker's bonus tax. They never would have done that. So that in a sense, there is a way in which we on the left always want more and more, and we bank everything. Mansion tax, fine, yes, all right, now what's next? And then we don't say, hang on a minute, that's really quite radical compared to what New Labour was like. Partly, the things disappear because the noise that's made about politics is so dominated by the right-wing press that those policies just disappear. And the Guardian is about, and the Independent and to some extent the FT, the only ones who ever kind of remind anybody what Labour's policies really are. And they may keep saying them over and over again. I mean, today, for instance, they did put out a very strong press release about how bad this government was being on tax evasion. Because Cameron has announced that he's going to have a sort of list of bad people, but I think they'll all be kind of criminals rather than companies. Or criminal companies. And Labour is saying, they should have done much more with the Swiss bank accounts. It's risen now to at least 35 billion. That's a conservative estimate of the, and they would do more about collecting tax avoided and evaded. So give them a bit of credit, and keep reminding everybody that they are actually quite radical. And, that the fate of being a Labour supporter, which, we get to our age, is to be perpetually angry at them. And when they're in power, you'll be even angrier with them. You'll be even more disappointed. On Trident, I think they will fudge it. I think they'll say, we'll have a defence review when we're in power. They won't announce beforehand that they're going to scrap it. They'll say, we think we could probably find a slightly cheaper way.
Unless the Scottish voters next year determine the fate of Trident by declaring for independence. Can I ask Steve to answer your question? Because we were in Edinburgh at the end of August, and Steve wrote, I think, a fantastic column saying, increasingly, when you're in Scotland, it feels politically like a very, very different space. Now, whether that will translate into a decision by Scottish voters next year in favour, but what do you think?
Yeah, well, thank you. It's very, because I do this politics show which we do here on Saturday, and I did it in Edinburgh at the festival, and I kept on everything I said, but of course this doesn't affect any of you in Scotland, so I was about David Cameron, but of course this does. And you suddenly realise that a combination of things means that whatever happens in this referendum, Scotland is already going its own way. So the devolution settlement in 1997, which Blair aimed to make as cautious as possible, it just happens that the powers they gave the Scottish Parliament over health, education and so on were the very issues that this coalition is most exercised about. So the coalition in Westminster is reforming education, health and so on. And none of it touches Scotland.
Well,
because
Social Security does.
Social Security.
In a big way.
But when you're talking about student fees, as you know, and all these other things, it doesn't affect Scotland. And meanwhile, all three Westminster leaders have promised that if Salmond loses this thing, they will still give the Scottish Parliament more powers. So it seems to me Scotland is going its own way, irrespective of the referendum. I mean, the pollsters told me when I was in Edinburgh that it's going to be lost, the independence argument, and they would put money on it now. But I think you sense, David, Salmond still might win it.
I think it might depend a bit on whether they feel that the Conservatives are going to win the next election.
Yeah, that's the great wild card, isn't it?
I mean, David and I did our talk in Edinburgh, where Steve was too, about Dogberry and disarrays, but even about the Tories. And we suddenly realised that we were like people from another planet. Yeah. They were kind of looking at us thinking, why are you talking to us about Tories? We don't have any here. It's quite interesting that it's from some distant place. And I think each year we've been back, we've all been back to each year, it's felt more and more distant. Yeah. And increasingly, I think, I say to them, please don't go. Don't do this to us. Don't leave us. We need you. We love you. Don't leave us to English Conservative future. But I increasingly think that if I was Scottish, I would probably go for it.
You would go for independence. Would you, David?
If you're a Scottish voter, this is not an ethnic vote. It's a vote based on residence.
The residence is
very important point.
Well, yeah, because you wish you had a vote just because you come from there, but you don't live there.
But would you? If you
like this gentleman, the idea of say the Conservatives were re-elected in 2015, I think that prospect would certainly tip me in one direction.
Right. Okay. Has anyone got one last question? One thing I didn't check up on is what time we needed to end this, but I think Jonathan, Kennedy, we've got. Are you both okay?
No, fine.
Are you all okay?
Great.
Okay. Yeah. We'll be kicked out. Who else would like to ask? From this side. Okay. Yeah.
Mine's a bit of a policy nerd question. But you said that this government is very radical and right-wing, and the kind of examples you cite are health and education, and you say that the state has been privatised. A lot of people would say that some of that was started in the last New Labour government, and that actually, when you're citing the kind of the best things about the New Labour government, you also talk about health and education, and Sure Start, which was also commissioned out to lots of private providers. Do you still think it's a kind of radical movement that's very much about this government, or, as a lot of ministers in this government would like to say, it's more of a kind of evolution of Blairite politics?
Okay, thank you. And is there a question from this side, or should we go straight to... Yeah.
So it's 2015, we get a Labour government, or a Labour-led government. How much of the nasty stuff that this government has done can they dismantle? Or are we stuck, are my children, my grandchildren stuck with, semi-privatised NHS, punitive attitudes to welfare? How much can they unravel from what they've done now?
Right, those two questions are sort of related, really. I think we'll need to be here until midnight to explore the implications of them. Let's deal with this first, the sort of Blairite continuity issue, which incidentally is one of the reasons why I think Ed Miliband has problems opposing some of these things, because they just come and say, well, we're carrying on what your election-winning leader did. And do you accept that there is a degree of continuity as well as radical departure?
We've just had an example of an alarming example of continuity. Simon Stevens, who was Tony Blair's right-hand man as advisor in number 10 on health, since went off to run United Health, the biggest private health company in America, has come back now as head of NHS England. Well, he's just about to come back, it's been announced. And he wrote a piece in the Financial Times after Labour had lost the election saying, that Blair had been prevented from pushing forward with his whole agenda. The agenda hadn't got very far. It was a few ISTCs, independent treatment centres, which were quite about half of them were private and about half of them were NHS, and they were put down to cut waiting lists for elective cold surgery. Very effective, actually, hips, knees, cataracts. It got through rather expensively, it cost a lot more, got through treatments very fast, cut down waiting lists, and actually electrified consultants who'd relied on private practice having long waiting lists. It was quite effective in a way, but it did hugely open the door to the idea that you could have these private contractors come in and take over chunks. It was small chunks, but it was there. And there is Simon Stevens back in office saying that's what Blair wanted to do, but he was stopped by Brown and by reactionary forces within Labour. Huge fights over foundation trust, hospitals being so independent. And actually they had their independence severely curtailed because of that row, something Brown did, that he was right about. And, certainly academies. But academies also, Andrew Adonis was the founder of academies, but they were beautiful new schools in the very poorest areas, failing schools. That was the idea. It was putting resources into schools that really needed it in areas that needed it. That is very different to the free school movement, or the idea that virtually every school should be forced to become an academy and allowed to become grammar schools if they want to, because nobody oversees their admissions. There was a very strict admissions code. Actually, Ed Balzer wrote an even stricter one when he was in charge of schools. And in a sense, admissions codes are the key to that. You might have less objection to free schools or academies or anything else if you knew that the admissions were absolutely fair. So that, yes, Labour opened the door to all of this. And maybe Blair, particularly now looking back on it, wishes he'd gone further, done more. It does make it harder for Ed Miliband to oppose some of these things. But, when Brown came in, and Andy Burnham was Health Secretary, he did say the NHS will be the preferred provider. And that was a really important moment that put an absolute dead stop to privatisation. He will do it again. He'll come in. The first thing he'll do will be to repeal the NHS Act and say NHS is preferred provider. Some of it will have gone up, but the contracts do come to an end. Some of them are 5 years, some of them 8 years. But you could say all of those contracts will fall back at the end of that time. So it's at the end of 5 years, it's repairable. At the end of 10, I think it's not.
Do you agree, David, that it's repairable, in inverted commas, after 2015? I mean, you looked at how the coalition either moved in a radically different direction or sped on with some of these reforms. So a lot of them have been around for a very, very long time. And as Polly says, people from the Blair era are now coming back in to run NHS England and so on.
I fear the scale of the legislation would be required. I mean, I'm a non-executive director of an NHS trust, and looking at what's happening in NHS through my trust's eyes, the scale of legislation would be required to reconstruct a system. I mean, there's a lot of talk at the moment about trying to integrate a system which has got all sorts of forces pulling it apart. And it would require much more than a one-line bill. It would require not just the repeal of the 2012 Health and Social Care Act, but lots of new legislation to sort of put pointers in the system so that people did function as an NHS, a single NHS entity. And you have police, you have schools, you've got welfare. The scale of the legislation would be required to rescind some of what the present government's done, let alone all of it, is such that, I mean, the parliamentary majority required, the parliamentary time required. I'm fearful that even if Labour had a majority or were the leading party, it would find the arithmetic of Parliament very, very difficult to put together in the way required.
Okay, thank you very much. Slightly different responses to your question. If no one else got the very last question.
Okay, one area of continuity is the support of faith schools in education, which Blair pushed a lot. Is that a good thing?
Faith schools.
Immediate past president of the Humanist Association. No. Terrible, dire, absolutely terrible. It's quite funny that this Muslim school that appears to have had no checking whatever before it was given quite large resources to be a free school. No, I think it was a terrible mistake. Blunkett said, "I'd like to bottle the magic that faith schools have because their results are so much better than everyone." The magic was quite simple. It was middle-class parents getting down on their knees to get their children into what amounted to selective faith schools, so they got better results. It was a way of busting through the admissions code. No, dreadful.
Okay, I think that's pretty clear. I suspect you'll agree with that. Look, we've got to end now. Just for a bit of fun, I'm not going to ask you who you want to win the next election, because we've already agreed this is a totally unrepresentative audience. But I'm going to ask you who you think will win the election, just for a bit of fun. We've given our predictions. How many of you think, just out of interest, that Labour will win an overall majority at the next election, 2015? Blimey. Right. You know that the bookies say that's the most likely outcome. So we're, again, totally unrepresentative
Isn't
here.
it really depressing?
What, the prediction?
Yeah.
Or
No, the two members of the audience.
Only two. Very.
You were one of them.
Okay. And you all right. Could I ask, so this is just a bit of fun, how many of you think the Conservatives will win an overall majority at the next election? Right, a few more, but not many. So how many of you think the next election will be another hung parliament in some shape or form? Wow.
Of any shape or form.
In any shape. So it gets too technical to work out precisely what.
Well, let's try. How many think is going to be president, going to be Prime Minister Miliband? Well, an awful lot of people don't think anyone is going to win.
So how many think Cameron will be Prime Minister after the election in a hung parliament? Right. Clegg? A vote for Clegg. Well.